It all began with a girl standing beside a brown car outside of a pharmacy. Although extremely alarming in hindsight, it didn't seem all that odd when the girl opened the door and hopped in. It wasn't until what was learned later that this single incident would set off one of the most disturbing and tragic cases in New York history. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. It had been a gloomy, rainy fall day until the sun began to peek out over Rochester, New York on November 16, 1971. And little 10-year-old Carmen Cologne had gotten home from school not long before the bad weather started to break. And despite her age, Carmen had some rather adult responsibilities in her home life. She lived with her grandparents in Rochester's Bull's Head neighborhood, and often her guardians would take her to help with various errands that needed to be run. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Carmen's grandfather Felix needed a prescription to be picked up at a nearby pharmacy and asked his granddaughter to walk with him. It was something the pair had done countless times before, but this time, instead of willfully going along with Felix, Carmen begged her grandfather to let her go alone. After all, she was growing up, the pharmacy was down the street, and the perception in the early 1970s was different than today. In response, Felix couldn't help but smile at Carmen's insistence, and within moments of her pleading, he gave in and agreed to let her go by herself to grab the prescription. Carmen was a tiny girl with dark eyes and was originally born in Puerto Rico, but was sent to Rochester to live with her grandparents for a chance at a better life, but unfortunately the family was still defined by financial struggle. This, combined with her small stature and the fact that she spoke almost no English at all, made her a natural target for bullies at school and in the neighborhood. But in any case, she was excited about getting to make the 2-block trip to the pharmacy by herself and bounced out the door. When she arrived at the pharmacy, she asked for her grandfather's prescription, but the pharmacist told her that it was still being processed and wasn't quite ready yet. Carmen would have to wait for it to be filled out, but something strange seemed to come over her as she learned this. Almost in a panicked voice, she said that she had to go right then and made a beeline for the door. She didn't exactly make a scene about it, but it was a reaction far enough out of the norm for other pharmacy patrons to take note and watch as Carmen got back out onto the sidewalk and walk up to a parked car. Moments later, she entered the vehicle and it hastily pulled away. An hour later, Rochester was in the middle of its weekday rush hour as motorists moved along the Interstate 490 west. Many of them were in their own worlds as they drove, but that bubble shattered at the sight ahead of them. Running along the side of the highway without clothes from the waist down was a girl with a terrified look on her face. She was also waving her arms in the air, trying to get any one of the 100 or so cars that went by to stop. Motorists then noticed that there was a car along the side of the highway that was backing up as if it was chasing the girl down. And traveling at an average speed of 70 miles per hour on this part of the interstate, maybe people thought they were going too fast to stop. Or maybe they were just in a hurry to get home after a long day of work. Whatever the case, horrifyingly, not a single person pulled over to see if the girl needed help. They kept going, thinking it was odd that she was running down the highway, but not thinking enough of it to pull over. And just 2 days later, the sight of the girl in desperate need of help would come to forever haunt those who saw her. On November 18th, 2 teenage boys were riding their bicycles near the town of Churchville just outside Rochester and came across what they first thought was a doll in a roadside ditch. The boys then stopped to check it out and quickly realized that the figure in the ditch was no doll. It was a girl lying in the gully against a rock, completely unclothed, and she was dead. It was Carmen. Her coat later turned up in a culvert about 300 feet from her body, and her pants were later found not far from where motorists had seen her running for her life. The autopsy then confirmed everyone's worst fears. She had been assaulted, she had a fractured skull, a broken vertebrae, and deep scratches likely from fingernails. And with this horrifying discovery, overnight, Rochester's sense of safety was completely destroyed. Parents started watching their children like hawks, and nobody walked alone anymore, because clearly a predator was out there and it was someone bold enough to snatch someone in broad daylight. Not only that, but the community proved that it was unwilling to help a child in distress, and the city was outraged when it learned that so many cars saw her running down the highway. In the early 1970s, Rochester was the kind of place that prided itself on hard work and quiet neighborhoods. It was a blue-collar town propped up by industry giants like Kodak and Xerox, and it was where families scraped by on factory wages and kids ran in the streets until the streetlights came on. It wasn't perfect, obviously, no place is, but for most parents there was a sense that the worst of the world always happened somewhere else, and certainly not in Rochester. Carmen's murder destroyed that illusion. For the first time, parents looked at their children and felt a fear they couldn't shake. The idea that someone could do this in their city was unthinkable, but it was also worse than that. She was hunted, brutalized, and discarded like garbage. And it wasn't just the violence, it was the randomness of it. She was taken doing something every kid did back then. Back then, there were no stranger danger assemblies at school or Amber Alerts for missing children. Kids were expected to be independent to a point to earn their keep in small ways, getting groceries, picking up prescriptions, or helping out around the neighborhood. Carmen's death changed all of that. Suddenly, letting your kid run to the corner store didn't feel like teaching responsibility. It now felt like rolling the dice with their life. But amid this new sense of awareness, though, Rochester still wasn't ready for what came next. Carmen's murder, as it turned out, wasn't a one-off tragedy. It was instead a warning shot no one could see at the time. It was only the first chapter in what would become one of the most haunting, unsolved murder sprees the city and the country had ever seen. By the spring of 1973, Carmen's murder 2 years earlier was already starting to fade into that uneasy place in the city's memory. It was still raw, but easier to not think about. And maybe it was a one-time thing, people told themselves. Something terrible for sure, but it was over, at least they hoped. Wanda Wilkowitz was everything Carmen wasn't. She was a fiery, red-haired, scrappy 11-year-old tomboy with the bruised elbows and knees to prove it. If there was trouble to find on the block, Wanda was in the middle of it, wrestling with the neighborhood boys, roughhousing, and always laughing just a little too loud. Among some of her classmates, this earned her ridicule. Her mother Joyce, on the other hand, always referred to her as a little bundle of energy, and Wanda's behavior did little to refute that. Life, however, hadn't been easy. Wanda's father died of a heart attack just a few years earlier, leaving Joyce to raise her daughter alone in a rough neighborhood on Rochester's east side. Money was also tight, and Wanda did what she could to help by running errands, grabbing groceries, or anything else that might ease the burden on her mother. April 2nd, 1973 was no different than most others. It was a gray, drizzly Monday, and Wanda's job that day was to pick up a few things from the corner grocery store. She left the house around 5 o'clock, and by 5:15, she was leaving the store with a bag full of milk, tuna, cupcakes, and cat food, which came to a grand total of $8.52. According to one witness, Wanda was last seen standing beside a large brown car talking to the driver. This was apparently a calm interaction with no signs of distress. Around the same time, though, another woman a few blocks away claimed that she saw a man forcing a red-haired girl she was sure was Wanda into a light-colored Dodge Dart sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m. And then by 8 o'clock that night, Joyce had grown into an anxious mess when Wanda didn't come home. Wanda was never late, and it was now completely dark out. Joyce then called the police, who, perhaps remembering the case of Carmen, responded quickly. Nearly 50 detectives and officers then spread out, combing several square miles around Wanda's home. They searched the banks of a river where Wanda liked to play, tore through empty lots, and followed every dead-end lead. But the next morning at 10:15 a.m., a state trooper stumbled onto her body. She was fully clothed and discarded at the bottom of a steep embankment off State Route 104 in Webster, about 15 miles northeast of Wanda's neighborhood. And the position of her remains told a horrific story. She hadn't simply been dumped. It seemed that she'd been thrown from a moving vehicle, and the autopsy was even more grim. Wanda had been assaulted, and there were ligature marks on her neck. Her body was also covered in bruises, and there were defensive wounds showing that Wanda had fought back. The autopsy also revealed that she'd eaten right before her death because food still sat undigested in her stomach. It seemed that whoever took her gave her a last meal. There were also traces of bodily fluids and hair found on Wanda's body, as well as something even more curious, which was white cat fur. Wanda's family owned a cat, but it didn't have a single white hair on its body, so where had the fur come from? For the first time, police publicly connected the dots. Carmen's murder wasn't an isolated tragedy. Rochester had a predator on its hands, and the city spiraled. A reward of $10,000 was posted, and tips flooded in. Eyewitnesses then remembered the brown car, which gave police their first solid lead, but no suspects just yet. Little did they know, however, that a pattern was forming right before their eyes. They just couldn't see it yet, but it would become obvious in a few short months. If anyone in Rochester still clung to the hope that Wanda's murder was the last, those hopes were shattered on November 26, 1973. Just 2 days after Thanksgiving, another girl vanished. Michelle Maenza was the same age as Wanda, but much more shy and quiet. Like Wanda, though, life hadn't been kind to her either. Her family struggled, living in poverty, and the signs were hard to miss in Michelle's ragged clothing and often unwashed hair. This made her an easy target for bullies, and up to that point, things had been bad at school. That Monday, Michelle ended up in the school nurse's office sobbing. Her classmates had apparently teased her so badly that day that she asked to be excused from class in tears. After her visit, the nurse, likely trying to be kind, let her out of school early, and Michelle slipped out the door and disappeared into the cold gray afternoon. Earlier in the day, her mother had left her purse at a nearby shopping plaza not far from school, so Michelle was apparently heading that way to pick it up. It should have been simple and safe, but instead, the 11-year-old crossed paths with someone. The first sighting came from a witness who swore she saw Michelle sitting in the passenger seat of a beige or tan car at a hamburger stand. The driver was a white man with dark hair and dirty hands, and he came back to the car carrying food. The witness also said that Michelle had a scared look on her face. Then, a little later, a motorist saw a scene that made his skin crawl. A man was standing beside his car on Route 350 in Walworth, holding a little girl by the wrist. The car had a flat tire, but when the motorist slowed down to help, the man made it clear that no help was needed. He pulled the little girl behind him, blocking the license plate of his car, and stared down the Good Samaritan with a look so cold and menacing that the witness immediately drove off. Michelle was reported missing later that evening when she didn't come home. By then, Rochester knew what was about to happen. 2 days later, a farmer found Michelle's body face down in a ditch in the neighboring Wayne County. Like Wanda, Michelle was fully clothed, but like Carmen and Wanda, she had been assaulted and killed. Michelle also had evidence of blunt force trauma scattered across her body. The autopsy also showed that she had eaten a hamburger with onions just before her death, corroborating the story of the witness who claimed to have seen Michelle with a man at a hamburger stand. Clinging to her clothes were also strands of white cat fur, and leaf samples found in her clenched fist matched the foliage around the ditch where she was located, suggesting that she likely died right there. For the first time as well, police had a partial palm print that was left on Michelle's neck. More than anything though, police had 2 witnesses who had gotten a good look at the abductor. They described him as a white male between 25 and 35 years of age, about 6 feet tall, and weighing about 165 pounds. With this description, police had a composite sketch made, which just as quickly hit newspapers and TV stations. A hotline was also set up to retrieve tips from the public, and even at its slowest, calls were coming in at a rate of 75 per hour. But just like their attempts to find Carmen and Wanda's abductor though, nothing stuck. And in the case of Michelle, one final heart-wrenching detail emerged. Her own uncle happened to see her that day and offered her a ride home, but Michelle turned him down. She wanted to walk instead. As police dug deeper into the investigation after Michelle's body was found, the pattern was impossible to ignore, and it reinforced that this was clearly not random or just a coincidence. 3 girls were gone, and each one was pulled from their respective neighborhoods in broad daylight, and every time the details lined up with a very specific criteria. All were about the same age of 10 or 11, all came from struggling families and carried the weight of broken homes. All 3 were also Catholic. None of them were kids that anyone paid much attention to. All the abductions also occurred during weekday afternoons on dreary gray days. All 3 also disappeared after school while running a simple errand. And each one was spotted willingly getting into or talking to someone in a car. And apart from that one account relating to Carmen, there were no signs of struggle, no screaming, nothing. It was as if they had been convinced they were safe. And then came the part that earned the case its name, the most puzzling coincidence of all, the initials. Carmen Cologne was found near Churchville, Wanda Walkowitz was found in Webster, and Michelle Mayanzit was found in Macedon. 3 girls, each with matching double initials, found in places whose names corresponded to those initials. Statistically, this was an astronomical unlikelihood. The press then latched onto this, dubbing these the alphabet murders or double initial killings. Theories then also began to emerge, like was the killer choosing victims because of their names, or was he picking them out of some sort of twisted logic no one could decipher? Some even believed that the pattern was a clue, almost like a message from the killer himself, and speculated that the letters CWM might stand for Come With Me. And this in turn almost felt like taunting, like the person was daring the city to catch him. And with Michelle's death also, the city was done being terrified. Instead, Rochester was furious. Parents wanted answers, the media wanted blood, and the police wanted a suspect. But unfortunately, no one got what they wanted. From the start, the investigation was a logistical nightmare. 4 agencies, the New York State Police, the Rochester Police, and the Monroe and Wayne County Sheriff's Offices scrambled to work together. Leads poured in and theories multiplied. The special hotline that was set up never seemed to stop ringing, and thousands of calls came in, but most of the information was useless. There were some pieces and fragments of evidence that gave investigators hope they were closing in. They had the white cat fur found on Wanda and Michelle and the partial palm print found on Michelle's neck, and other actual physical evidence in the form of bodily fluids and hair. In the early 1970s though, reliable DNA testing was still years away, and those clues ended up more frustrating than helpful. What bothered investigators most though was the pattern. If this was a serial offender, he was smart, careful, and calculated, but some detectives, especially early on, weren't convinced that Carmen's case fully fit with the alphabet murders, particularly due to the manner of her death. Unlike Wanda and Michelle, Carmen had hand marks on her neck from the front, indicating a closeness between her and the perpetrator. Wanda and Michelle, meanwhile, had ligature marks from behind. Carmen's body was also left completely unclothed, unlike the other 2. This led to other questions like maybe she was the killer's first attempt that became something more refined later. Or maybe Carmen was the victim of someone else entirely. Unfortunately though, no one could say for sure, and that haunted the case. Over the course of decades, the list of potential suspects grew to exceed 800, bloating the case file with names, mugshots, dead-end leads, and men who had done terrible things but couldn't be tied to these particular murders. There were some that seemed more related than others though, and the first serious name was close to home. Miguel Cologne, Carmen's own uncle, quickly landed at the center of the investigation. Miguel had a temper, a sketchy past, and just weeks before Carmen's death, he happened to buy a car that happened to match the one witnesses described reversing down Route 490 when Carmen was last seen alive. And after the discovery of the body, police then got their hands on the vehicle and found it had been scrubbed clean inside and out. The trunk apparently practically reeked of cleaning agents. Then in the back of the car, they also found a doll that belonged to Carmen. At the same time though, the family insisted that it was nothing because Carmen had been inside Miguel's car a few times already, but it just didn't sit right with police. And then, like any good suspect, Miguel ran. 4 days after Carmen's body was found, he packed up and bolted back to Puerto Rico. He came back to Rochester years later and was questioned but never charged. Then in 1991, after a violent domestic dispute where Miguel shot his wife and brother-in-law, he turned the gun on himself as police arrived. And to this day, some still think he was the man who killed his niece, while others aren't so sure, because Miguel was far from the only monster police had to deal with. Another name rose fast, that of Kenneth Bianchi, who was convicted of a series of murders that took place in LA between 1977 and 1979. Before he reached infamy, Kenneth was just a guy born and raised in Rochester who sold ice cream and blended into the background. While living in Rochester, he even drove a car that matched the description from one of the abduction scenes. So for a moment, it felt like maybe they had their guy, but the FBI compared the palm print left on Michelle to Kenneth and there was no match. Kenneth also denied everything too, and without physical evidence, police had no choice but to rule him out. So next, perhaps one of the most interesting suspects on paper is a serial offender named Joseph Nasso, who had a strikingly similar signature to his crimes. Throughout the 1970s and 1990s, Joseph killed women with the same double initials across Northern California. He also grew up in Rochester and traveled back and forth between New York and California often. And if alarms aren't already going off in your head, one of the interesting facts about his spree in California is that one of his victims there had a familiar name, Carmen Cologne. These similarities were obviously impossible to ignore. Investigators then jumped on it, praying that this was the break they needed, but DNA testing crushed that hope. Joseph's profile didn't match the evidence from the Rochester killings. It was just another coincidence in a case with more than the police cared to count. So police eventually turned their attention to a man named Dennis Termini. He was a Rochester firefighter by day, but apparently was a predator by night. Between 1971 and 1973, the same span that saw the murders of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle, Dennis allegedly attacked at least 14 teenage girls and young women, dragging them into garages at gunpoint where he assaulted them. Dennis also drove a beige car, the same color seen in multiple abduction reports, and when police searched it, they found white cat hair on the seats. And if that wasn't enough, they discovered Dennis's firefighter uniform folded neatly inside, leading them to wonder if maybe he had used it to convey authority to coerce the girls into his vehicle. When police searched his car as well, they found a map folded in a way that highlighted Wayne County, right where Michelle's body turned up. And in fact, 5 weeks after Michelle's murder, Dennis tried to grab another girl. This time she screamed loudly though, and police were alerted. Dennis then ran off and police chased him through yards and over fences before cornering him. Before they could apprehend him though, Dennis produced a gun from his pocket and ended things by his own hand. It was a moment that again felt like a confession, but even this wasn't the break that Rochester needed. In 2007, police had taken such an interest in Dennis that they arranged to exhume his body to run DNA against the samples collected from Wanda and Michelle. It was a long shot, but police remained hopeful while they waited for the results to come back. When they did though, there was no match. It wasn't him. And just like that, the last strong hope to solve the Alphabet murders died all over again. Everyone else, every name, and every lead was either ruled out or faded into obscurity. Some detectives still argued that Carmen's murder was different and that maybe her killer wasn't the same man who took Wanda and Michelle. And if that's true, it means that two monsters were hunting in the same place at the same time. After hundreds of suspects and thousands of man-hours, not a single arrest has ever been made in the Alphabet murders. The predator, whoever he was, slipped through every net, and half a century later, the city still wonders if he's out there somewhere. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.